This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. With the official start of the hurricane season only a little more than a month away, much is still being learned about the post-hurricane care problems at some independent living facilities. A news article this week had the ominous headline, "People are going to die. Few changes have been made." We'll examine what needs to be done. We'll also look at the latest from the legislature, as well as an innovation in crime investigations, plus something new in the state's news media, and the Jazz Fest as a cultural influencer. On stage for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol, Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Greg LaRose, editor-in-chief, Louisiana Illuminator. Michael Isaac Stein, senior reporter, Verité News. And Mike Perlstein, investigative reporter, WWL-TV Channel 4. Go over to Michael first, Isaac Stein. You did a piece about independent living facilities, senior housing, but living independently. We saw a real problem with many of them after Ida, when no power, and that presented a real problem. So the city sort of stepped up to try to make sure this is taken care of, but you found out that's not really happening.
Yeah, like you said, a lot of the problems we saw after Hurricane Ida were at these independent senior living facilities. 8 out of the 21 people identified as dying in the aftermath were at these facilities, and they really just saw some of the most brutal scenes from after the storm. Powerless buildings, no staff on site, medically vulnerable people without access to medication, oxygen, dialysis, things like that. And in the aftermath, as you said, that was a place of focus for the city to promise that, something like this would never happen again. The city experienced a roughly 10-day blackout in the aftermath, and these facilities weren't evacuated until about a week into that blackout. And so a lot of focus has been there. And probably the biggest legislative change that was made after Ida was a process to license these facilities. So unlike nursing homes, assisted living facilities, they're not regulated by the state. They aren't required to have medical staff on site. They aren't required to have generators or evacuation plans. So the city wanted to have some sort of licensing process there. But what we've found is that the law is by and large not being followed. Out of 67 facilities that were identified by the city, only 26 got licenses this year. And there's even less, cooperation when it comes to the legal requirement that these facilities need to be in contact with the city during emergencies. During a deep freeze in December, only 12 of these facilities actually contacted the city. So the law is there, but we know the city hasn't taken any enforcement action against these facilities. So the law is there, but the enforcement is not.
Well, what would the enforcement be? I mean, a lot of these places, well, all of these places so far are in operation. And, as you said, they are independent living facilities. These are people who can live independently, but they are older and maybe do have health needs. So really, what can the city do to enforce what the needs could be to be addressed?
Absolutely. So the law, if you violate portions of the law says that there are fines in place. You can get your license revoked, and this is a longer process, but if you operate a business without a required business license, you can eventually get shut down. So there are paths to enforcement, and the city told us they're now working with the Department of Safety and Permits to work out that process. But you're right, they weren't required to get licenses before, but under this new law, they are.
So then in terms of those individuals who are living or considering living in one of these places, what should they be aware of and prepared for? Because we do live in a place where we get hurricanes.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stress that these facilities put forward, I mean, I've read through, 40-plus emergency plans that these types of facilities turned in, and a lot of them stress that you need to put a personal plan in place, and that if you are stuck in the city and not able to evacuate, you're going to have to rely on city services, EMS, other emergency response. I think I visited a lot of these places, and I think there are a lot of nerves with hurricane season coming up, and I think a lack of faith that city services are going to be there for them when they need it. So I think at the end of the day, these facilities, even the ones following the law, are not going to be fully responsible for the safety of these residents. And so, we get into this in the piece a little bit, but we really need to look at what the city is going to do differently. Why did it take them a week to evacuate these places? Why is it going to be different next time? Because, again, the full picture we're getting is that these facilities are not going to be safe to be at in the aftermath of storm, and that they're full of very vulnerable people.
Are we going to see again like we saw after Ida in some places where people were just loaded in a bus and taken to a warehouse somewhere and just and cots put out there and no real care?
I mean, I think part of the problem is that we don't really know. The city has updated some of its evacuation plans to kind of deal with this type of scenario, but it's very non-committal. They've said maybe we'll set up shelters, maybe we'll evacuate after the storm. But again, when you talk to seniors, part of that is, the nerves are we don't know what the city is going to do after a storm. So really, until one hits, we don't know. And I think that's what causes some anxiety among the residents.
So, you mentioned, you said the city did step up and help with evacuating some of these residents. It took a while, took about a week, which was a long week for those folks to be up there with no power, no air conditioning. Perhaps they were in wheelchairs, couldn't get down the stairs. So is there something in place where the city could perhaps step up evacuation a little bit faster?
So I think one problem when you look at the city's plans is that it's basically all based around calling for a mandatory evacuation, which requires having enough time in advance to get everyone out of the city. Now, if you remember with Ida, it intensified so fast that we didn't have time. And so I think when you look at the city's plans, there was much less, procedure and planning when it comes to a situation like Ida, where there was no time to get everyone out, and now we have tens of thousands of people stuck in a city that is virtually stalled, right? Businesses aren't open. Ambulances can't get down roads, and there's just not a lot of planning at this, right now for that type of scenario.
Yes. Having been through many hurricanes myself, you just don't know what kind of damage a hurricane is going to bring. Ida threw the city for a loop because it wasn't any problem with flooding, but it was the power outages due to the fallen transmission towers.
Right.
Left the city in the dark for some 10 days.
Absolutely.
Gas stations ran out of fuel for even generators. So that was the crisis for Ida.
Absolutely. I do think, though, that there are arguments, especially among senior advocates who say that the city, even though, the situation was unprecedented and obviously very difficult to navigate, the city should have known that these were the people that were going to be at the highest risk. The city didn't even start checking up on these facilities until 4 days after. By then, similar facilities in Jefferson Parish were already being evacuated. So, I mean, just comparing parish to parish, our response was certainly slower.
Does the city even have a contact list for who to get in touch with at some of these places?
So that's part of the licensing, right? I mean, part of it is just when Ida hit, they said we didn't even know how to reach people. We didn't know where these facilities were. So part of the licensing is we just need a list. And again, the facilities are not all applying. So the city still does not have that list, which obviously doesn't fix everything. But, the city said it would certainly help.
All right, Michael, thanks a lot. I'm
Thank
sure
you.
we'll be finding out more from you about this, how
Absolutely.
this moves along. Okay, over to you. You wanted to talk a little bit about changes in media and news coverage.
I thought a couple of interesting developments this week is that the Georges Media Group, which is the group that John Georges runs, announced the formation or the opening of something called the Shreveport-Bossier Advocate. Now, don't look for a copy of that in the newspaper stand because it's going to be a website-oriented thing, which opens, I think, in June, but it's going to go across the state. Now, they already have newspapers, print newspapers, of course, in New Orleans, in Baton Rouge, in Lafayette, in Acadiana. But this is going to be something where you have a website, not a newspaper. But they're committed to it. So they're going to have a staff of 10 people, and they're going to really grow into it. And you read some of the comments, and admittedly, some of the comments are provided by the media group, but that people in the Shreveport area are longing for like a really serious news operation. There's a newspaper called the Shreveport Times, and some people, which is a Gannett newspaper, and some people say, you look at it sometimes and it's all syndicated things or things that are picked up from other things. There's not a lot of small reporting, and that probably happens in a lot of smaller cities where you really don't have the economy to pick up a big news operation. So this may be the future. This may be something that's going to happen in other cities, and I think what's going to happen in Shreveport-Bossier is something worth looking at because places like Grand Rapids, Michigan, those kind of places, this might be the way that the news media go. But the other thing that you're starting to see is that in doing this, they're announcing some kind of nonprofit support thing. They're aligned with a charity called the Community Foundation of North Louisiana, and they have an account called the Shreveport-Bossier Journalism Fund. And so they're asking people to contribute to that to support journalism. And you're seeing more of that kind of thing because a lot of news organizations are on the edge financially now. There's just so much competition out there. But like if you want like investigative reporting is really expensive. You need to be able to afford to have somebody out there who's away for maybe weeks just working on one story. You got to get lawyers' fees and everything else. And so it's expensive. And so you see it more and more, and you see it on Wikipedia and throughout the media. And so that's the other thing. And the third thing I just want to point out is an example we see at this table.
That's right.
That we've seen the three people here. One of them is from something called the Louisiana Illuminator, and the other is from
Verité News.
From Verité. These are what they call the nonprofit news organizations, and they have reporters. They have good reporters, and they do some good reporting, and they provide information that the other media are able to pick up, and so it's a good thing. We do that, as we did with this particular show. Mm-hmm. So you're seeing more and more of that kind of thing, and so they're doing things without their newspaper, without their own printing press, just like the Shreveport-Bossier Times. And so, so you've seen those kind of transformations.
I think sitting around this table, too, there would be agreement that local news is extremely important. Keeping that local news coverage is really, really important. And that's what your respective news organizations do, really deal heavily with the local and state news. And Greg, like the Illuminator, you said shares a lot of the material that you uncover.
Exactly, yeah. We have, newspapers around the state, but I think, key for us in our parent organization, State Newsroom, is recognizing that strictly filling a hole that exists in print newspapers is not the sole way that we move forward. Mm-hmm. Thus, we have, for example, informal partnerships with the gray TV stations around the state. Mm-hmm. It would include Fox 8 here locally in New Orleans, because we see that, as Errol points out, it's no knock on the journalists who are in these smaller markets, but there just aren't as many of them. And in addition to our core in Baton Rouge, we've sort of branched out to establish relationships with journalists around the state to help address, which I think the Georgia's move is really great news for journalism in Shreveport. We know that it's essentially, like other small markets, a news desert. So by all means, whether they are funded on the for-profit side or through nonprofit foundations like us, I think you see this pattern happening more and more.
I don't know if I mentioned the lens or not, but that was the first one to do this. Okay.
Yeah.
And then also,
Pioneers.
Verité has a stated mission to have more journalism targeted to the black community. And so some of them, are trying to reach a larger market. So it's a good thing that's happening at the time that things are fairly thin in the news media organization.
And news organizations sharing too, like your story on Verité was also WWNO and WRKF. So, all righty, thanks a lot, guys. And Greg, we're going to stay with you right now because there is a legislative session going on. What are they doing up there?
Well, we knew this was a fiscal only or fiscal centered session going in, but we knew it wouldn't put a back burner on the real culture war topics. And this week a couple came through a Don't Say Gay bill that they've tried in previous years to pass, but since one gained traction in Florida, it's regained a lot of attention. Representative Dodie Horton from the Houghton area is behind this, and Louisiana's version goes a bit farther than the Florida version in that there is a provision that would allow a student to ask their teachers and such to refer to them by something other than their birth name, or they could, request personal pronouns be changed. But what Horton's bill does is allow a teacher or whomever at school to object to it over moral or religious reasons, which understandably has people who want to see, the schools adhere to personal preferences. They are going to fight this.
And where is that now? Did it come out of committee?
It advanced from a House Education Committee.
Okay.
It goes to the House floor next.
All
And
right.
it is interesting that in so many of the cultural issues in schools, that an argument for some restrictions is to adhere to what parents want. But I would imagine that a parent in a family probably wants children to have the freedom to be referred to by the name that they choose. So this goes against the arguments that we've been seeing in places like Florida.
Yeah, a lot of the conservative arguments in terms of education issues has been parental choice. Let's get parental choice back in education. And this Don't Say Gay bill essentially goes in the opposite direction.
Also, parental choice regarding books, right?
Yeah, another bill that advanced from the Senate Education yesterday, and it's quite controversially. This is from Senator Heather Cloud up in North Louisiana. She wants all public libraries in the state to have a card system to where it would restrict the holder, a child, from accessing material they would deem sexually explicit. Her bill includes a lot of language that essentially defines that term. The controversy came up. There were, a few dozen people on both sides that had showed up at the Capitol yesterday to, share their 2 cents on this. And just about 3 people in on the proponent side, Senator Bodie White of Central called for the question, which in effect just shuts down the debate. And no one else on the committee said, no, don't do that.
No more public comment.
Exactly. So they advanced the bill without objection. And that is just rubbing people wrong. And I think it should so on both sides of the issue because, Bodie White was heard over the microphone whispering to a colleague, I've got 14 people waiting on me, just let them go. But he may not have known the procedure. He could have just left and the debate would have continued, but he chose to call the question.
Allowing people to, as you said, put in their 2 cents, because there are a lot of proponents of the bill who are not able to speak, as well as opposition. Okay, one other issue you wanted to talk about unemployment benefits.
Yeah, there's a bill that advanced from a House committee yesterday that it essentially cuts unemployment benefits in half. It shortens that period over which you can receive the benefits, or it really maxes it out over that time. And the Louisiana Workforce Commission that administers the unemployment program said that poor people will be adversely affected because when you shorten that time frame, you are denying people a chance to get training that would allow them to obtain another job. So the fear is that it'll make a bad situation worse.
It would shorten it to what? It's 26 weeks now, right?
It's 26 weeks now, but it's more along the lines of how they condense the payments. They will cut off the payments basically in half at that 26 weeks.
Okay, and this would achieve what for the state?
Well, they are, the author, Representative Troy Romero from Southwest Louisiana, says that Louisiana really needs to avoid a situation that they saw during the pandemic where the fund would dwindle down for unemployment insurance, next to nothing. State officials have said, we were okay. We were able to replenish that fund. We made it through. We're going to be fine with all of the changes made since then. So they kind of question whether or not that's the best approach.
And employers have to pay into that unemployment fund.
Exactly.
So they would, arguably, according to the proponents, they wouldn't have to pay as much.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. So that's just moving along, right? Where is that?
It is. That advanced to the House as well.
Okay. All righty. Thanks a lot, Greg. A lot of action going on in Baton Rouge. Okay, Mike, let's go on over to you right now. You did a piece about, this is regarding ankle monitoring and how it can help actually locate a suspect, and it did in one case.
Well, it certainly did in a very high-profile double murder. You might recall in Lundy Gras, February 20th, a 21-year-old who appeared to be the intended target of a hit jumps in an Uber out in eastern New Orleans, and gunmen ride behind, jump out, and fire shots into the car, killing the 21-year-old and the Uber driver, completely unsuspecting 35-year-old who was taking his first ride of the night. It got even more horrific when the car went out of control and plowed onto the interstate, crashed into another passing car. The gunman did not stop there, jumped out, continued to fire away. The 3 women in that passing car were all injured from the accident. One of them caught a bullet to the head. So this was a high-profile case, and police were able to use technology, and some new, some old, and some sort of rediscovered, but they used license plate readers, some surveillance cameras. They zeroed in on a suspect by the name of Tyree Quinn. Well, it turns out that Tyree Quinn was out on bail, and as a condition by the bail bondsman, not by a court, not by a judge, but as a condition of his bail, because it was a high bail of $225,000 on an armed robbery, the bail bondsman required him to have an ankle monitor. And what that is an electronic device using satellite and cell phone towers to track the location. And the NOPD homicide detectives did just that. And with all of the technology, they were able to almost literally pinpoint his location minute by minute, before, during, after the killing, and put him directly at the scene of the shooting on the minute that it happened and got reported. It would seem to be a clincher. They solved this in 10 days, arrested him, which was also quite easy because of the GPS signal from the ankle monitor. They were able to pinpoint his location, arrest him, know his location without incident. So I was able to get access to the GPS tracking and show. It was incredibly chilling to see what we call tracking a murder, was the title of my series. And you could see that it wasn't just, you know, happenstance, having to cross paths with somebody who might have been a target, but the dot, which is crisscrossing, you know, the city, stops at a very specific location in the parking lot of an apartment complex, lying in wait in an ambush-style hit, it would appear. So police did a very good job with that. Now, I have a part 2 coming out tonight in which it's not so favorable for the police because 17 days earlier, there was another crime, and it involved Tyree Quinn along with his brother, Yamani Quinn. Long story short, during some drug surveillance, ended up in a major police chase of the two brothers across town, speeds of 100 miles an hour. State police helicopter was involved. They end up going all the way across town, near the courthouse on Tulane Avenue. They bail out. They catch Yamani Quinn and arrest him with a slew of drug charges, gun. They were in a stolen car. And they had identified Tyree Quinn, who escaped. What the police didn't do or put all of the dots together was that by being on an ankle monitor, they could have gone and checked and tracked him and picked him up that night.
Before
not,
the
next
Mardi
day.
Gras murder. Before the
17 days earlier. So that is being looked at as a missed opportunity. We go into detail, even talk to the widow of the Uber driver, and it is a technology that once upon a time, more than 10 years ago, it was run by the city through the police department and sheriff's office, and they did this proximity reporting. Everyone on a bracelet was in a database. You could track and match it to crimes. It solved a very high-profile murder of a pizza delivery person, back in the day. And
but now it's up to the bondsman?
Well, so that program collapsed. There were squabbles between the police department and the sheriff's office. Personnel issues now make it almost impossible that the NOPD could possibly run this themselves. However, the ankle monitoring company, the reputable ones, say, hey, we're willing to share our information. And in fact, this monitoring company, ASAP, they have provided access to 37 police officers now. Hey, you want to, you suspect that somebody involved in any of these crimes might be someone on an ankle monitor, either court-ordered or bail-ordered, please log in, check, match the dots, just the way they did with Tyree Quinn. They didn't in the case 17 days earlier. The hope in exposing this is maybe that they will up their game and use the available technology, because as we know, the police department is at this modern era low in officers, and they can use all the technology help they can get.
And we should know also there was no home confinement ordered in the case of Tyree and for that incident. Okay.
That's correct.
We're going to have to jump over to Errol's last segment because we're about out of time, but this is really interesting. It's on your website in case you missed it last night. And you have another one.
Tonight at 10.
Okay, 2 parts on WWL. All right. E, over to you, Jazz Fest.
Yeah, a few weeks ago I was talking to a guy during Tennessee Williams Festival, visiting journalists. And he was talking about New Orleans, he was talking about cities and their cultures, and he was asking me about, the culture in New Orleans, how is it being preserved? Well, we got a head start. If you remember after Katrina, everybody was worried about preserving the culture, and so there was a mission for that. But it doesn't last over time. But beyond that, as I was talking to him, I realized that what was really doing the most to preserve the culture is Jazz Fest. You know how important Jazz Fest is? That over 2 weekends and in this one space, all of the music and the arts and the food and everything else that's combined. There are some forms of music, like I maintain like gospel music. Now, gospel music's been around for a long time, but the presence it has in New Orleans and the awareness that the Jazz Fest has given to gospel music, I mean, has really elevated it. Zydeco music and Cajun music. I mean, just various styles of music. I hope it's given more attention to jazz, which is what it was all about. But when they have those in the jazz tent, there's always a huge crowd for it. And if that's making people appreciate, especially some of the elderly jazz musicians, you know, that's good. The food, a thing like cochon de lait, po' boy, it's an ancient food that's been around in central Louisiana for a long time. Here in New Orleans, we think we're like really kind of hip to it. It's something kind of new, but it's bringing those kind of dishes too. And so it's really just really important, more than just people hearing music. It has done a lot to preserve the culture.
Second lines, Mardi Gras Indians also.
The Mardi Gras Indians, a lot of people would never see the Mardi Gras Indians because they're in a part of town. But here they are, they're in the central ground, and so they have that visibility too.
Right, there's just this microcosm there in the fairgrounds of New Orleans culture, Louisiana culture too.
Yeah,
All righty,
too.
thanks a lot. Sticking with you, other stories.
Yeah, speaking of Louisiana culture, the company that owns Popeyes has announced they're going to have a new campaign to promote Popeyes, and where they're promoting New Orleans more than they have. And they have some sample commercials, but they're going to really go heavy. They're really trying to sell the image of New Orleans as a reason to buy chicken. And the idea they're getting across that the motto is, we don't make sense, we make chicken. And the idea is that other places use mass manufacturing things, but there's a New Orleans way of doing it. So New Orleans, starting in June, is going to get a big boost nationwide in those commercials.
Very good. All right, thanks, E. Greg, over to you.
I'm hungry now.
Yeah, I know.
So we learned through public records that parish officials in a to-be-named parish are paying next to nothing or nothing in some cases on their property taxes because their assessed values are so low. When we brought that to the attention of the tax assessor, he said it was the first time he'd heard about this.
Okay, we'll be looking for that Illuminator, right? Okay, over to you, Michael.
Yeah, I'm going to be watching, I think over the next little while, we're going to be seeing a lot on the police accountability front. There's obviously an ongoing effort to end the consent decree between the federal government and the NOPD. I had a story this week about the council's hesitance to fund the Office of Independent Police Monitor, which is expected to take up that accountability role once the consent decree ends. So watching how those things play out.
All right, thanks a lot. Mike, over to you.
And let's not forget, there's an election tomorrow, and on the ballot is a millage for the sheriff's office. All the
Orleans
political,
Parish, Orleans.
and all the political watchers seem to think that's going to go down in a lopsided way. So
Well, if you look at the street signage,
the only signage is against, but it really leaves the question, what is the sheriff, Susan Hudson, going to do next? Because in 2 years, her millage runs out. So there will have to be a way to fill that gap.
Okay, all right, guys. Thanks a lot for being here. Thank you all for joining us. See you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.